Savannah, Georgia, March 1829. A woman's hands tie a noose in the pre-dawn darkness, her fingers moving with the precision of someone who has dressed children. Braided hair and now prepares an instrument of death. 3 white men will hang by morning, and the entire city will wake to a truth they've spent generations denying, that mercy has limits, that maternal love transcends bondage, and that some debts can only be paid in blood. Who is the woman they would come to call the widow of Savannah, and what drove a mother to become an executioner? This isn't a story about rebellion. It's about mathematics, about the cold calculation that happens when a mother counts her children. 1, 2, 3, 4, and then counts them again to find only silence, about the moment when survival stops being enough, when breathing becomes betrayal, and when the only logic left is the logic of grief weaponized into vengeance. Before we continue, subscribe and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from and what time it is there. If you want access to exclusive, uncensored videos about the world's most brutal crimes, consider becoming a member. And don't forget to hit the like button. I want you to picture Savannah in the late 1820s, not the postcard version with Spanish moss and mint juleps, but the working city, a coastal machine designed to convert human beings into profit. The port groans under the weight of cotton bales, each one representing hundreds of hours of enslaved labor. The air itself is stratified. Near the docks, it reeks of rotting fish and ship tar. In the warehouse district, cotton dust creates a perpetual haze that coats your lungs. In the residential squares, magnolia and jasmine attempt to perfume over the underlying stench of chamber pots and horse manure. The soundscape is equally layered, the rhythmic hammering from shipyards, the musical cadence of gullah voices in the market, the crack of whips from the auction houses on Johnson Square, and underneath it all, the ever-present sound of chains. This is a city of roughly 7,000 people, nearly half of them enslaved. The economy doesn't just depend on slavery, it is slavery, a vast churning apparatus where human beings are assessed, sold, bred, and worked to death with the casual efficiency of any other agricultural process. Spring of 1829 is a boom time. Cotton prices are high. The demand for enslaved labor is insatiable, and in this environment, enslaved families are being torn apart at unprecedented rates, because in boom times, sentiment becomes an unaffordable luxury. Now, you have to understand the 3 men at the center of this story weren't monsters in the conventional sense, and that's precisely what made them so dangerous. First, there was Richard Holbrook, a respected cotton factor in his 50s, known for his regular church attendance and his reputation for fair dealing in business. His neighbors would have described him as stern but reasonable, a man who believed slavery was a biblical institution and approached it with what he considered Christian responsibility. Then there was Thomas Cuyler, younger, ambitious, a speculator who'd made his fortune buying and selling human beings with the same detached professionalism a stockbroker might trade shares. He kept meticulous records, treated his transactions as purely financial calculations, and genuinely believed he was participating in economic progress. Finally, James Blackwood, the overseer, a man from modest origins who'd clawed his way to a position of minor authority and wielded it with the desperate cruelty of someone afraid of falling back down. These men didn't see themselves as villains. They saw themselves as participants in a legitimate economy, doing what society, law, and custom told them was not just acceptable, but necessary. They attended the same churches as their neighbors, voted in the same elections, sent their children to the same schools. Their evil wasn't in their extraordinariness. It was in their ordinariness, in their complete inability to recognize the humanity of the people they owned. The public story was simple, and it had the virtue of being partially true. The widow, we'll call her Jane, though records vary on her real name, was a skilled domestic servant, a widow whose enslaved husband had died 2 years prior. She was known as reliable, quiet, and competent. Her 4 children, ranging in age from 3 to 11, were described in estate documents as likely, which was slavers' code for healthy and valuable. The official narrative that everyone accepted was straightforward. Jane and her children were assets of the Holbrook estate, part of a portfolio being liquidated to settle debts and capitalize on high cotton prices. This was business, nothing personal. The explanation given to Jane, and let's be real, explanation is a generous word for what was actually a notification, was that her children would have better lives, that they were going to good Christian homes, that this was actually fortunate for them. Holbrook himself apparently told her, with what he likely considered kindness, that she should be grateful her children would be raised in households of quality rather than worked in the fields. The paperwork was legal, properly notarized, approved by the appropriate authorities. In every technical sense, this was a routine transaction in an economy where such transactions happened dozens of times daily. The fact that it was destroying a family was legally irrelevant. The fact that Jane was a person capable of grief was philosophically unrecognized. Behind the genteel facade of Savannah's commercial district operated a sophisticated infrastructure of human trafficking that would make modern organized crime look unsophisticated. The Ryan Slave Mart on Johnson Square was the visible face, a two-story building with holding cells in the basement and an auction platform under a covered portico. But the real machinery extended much further. There was a network of Negro jails, private detention facilities where enslaved people awaiting sale were held, often in chains, sometimes for weeks. There was the established system of slave brokers who worked on commission, connecting buyers in the Deep South with sellers in the Upper South. There was even a primitive form of futures trading, where speculators would purchase enslaved people on credit, gambling on future cotton prices. The legal infrastructure was equally elaborate: contracts, bills of sale, insurance policies. Yes, you could insure your human property against death or escape, and a complex body of law governing every aspect of ownership, transfer, and liability. There were doctors who specialized in examining enslaved people for sale, certifying their health, and estimating their working lifespan. There were banks that accepted enslaved people as collateral for loans. There were shipping companies with dedicated routes for transporting human cargo, and overseeing it all was a civil bureaucracy: courts, clerks, notaries, tax assessors that processed these transactions with the same mundane efficiency they processed property deeds. This wasn't a crime, it was the law. When Jane began exhibiting what the historical records delicately call melancholic disturbance, there was an official explanation ready and waiting. The prevailing medical and philosophical wisdom of the 1820s held that enslaved people, particularly those of African descent, were simply less capable of the deeper emotions that characterized white people. Dr. Samuel Cartwright would later codify this pseudoscience into an actual diagnosis: drapetomania, the disease causing slaves to flee captivity. But the underlying assumptions were already firmly established. So when Jane stopped eating, when she stood motionless for hours staring at nothing, when neighbors reported hearing her keening at night, a sound one witness described as inhuman, like an animal caught in a trap, this was explained as simple adjustment difficulty, perhaps complicated by feminine hysteria. Richard Holbrook, in a letter to his brother, wrote that Jane was displaying the expected melancholy disposition common to Negro women of limited understanding when their routine is disrupted. The implicit logic was circular and self-sustaining. Enslaved people were not capable of deep parental love because they were enslaved. If they showed signs of deep parental love, these signs were reinterpreted as something else: sullenness, laziness, or simple-minded confusion. A white mother separated from her children would be experiencing unimaginable tragedy. An enslaved mother experiencing the same separation was merely displaying poor adjustment. This framework wasn't just racist pseudoscience. It was a necessary psychological defense mechanism that allowed the entire system to function. Every atrocity requires its bureaucrats, and Jane's children were sold with the assistance of a man named Augustus Moore, a clerk who processed estate sales and slave transactions for a 2% commission. Moore was 43 years old, married, father of 5, and by all accounts a mild-mannered man who kept precise records and never raised his voice. He would later testify that he'd processed the sale of Jane's children with the same professional detachment he'd brought to hundreds of similar transactions. He prepared the bills of sale, verified the buyer's financial credentials, arranged for transportation, and collected his fee. When Jane appeared at his office 3 days after her children were taken, begging, the historical record actually uses that word, begging, for information about where they'd been sent, Moore told her he was not at liberty to disclose business information to unauthorized parties. The fact that the unauthorized party was the children's mother was legally irrelevant. But Moore's complicity went deeper than passive processing. He had actively recruited the buyers, 2 plantation owners from Alabama and 1 from Mississippi, by advertising Jane's children as premium stock, well-trained, likely to breed well. That last phrase, appearing in his ledger, referred to Jane's 11-year-old daughter. Moore also facilitated the paperwork that would make it nearly impossible to ever reunite the family, ensuring the children were registered under their new owners' names with no reference to their origin or parentage. He erased their history as efficiently as he'd erased columns in a ledger. Let me tell you about the children because they were not abstractions. The eldest was Samuel, 11 years old, described in sale documents as intelligent, literate, trained in household service. That last detail is crucial. Jane had taught her son to read, a crime punishable by whipping in Georgia, an act of maternal defiance wrapped in bedtime stories. Samuel was sold to a cotton plantation in Alabama for $650, a premium price reflecting his skills and age. Next was Catherine, 9, who one witness remembered as having a voice like a mockingbird and who sang while she worked. She went to a different plantation in Alabama for $500. Then came Jacob, 6, described simply as healthy male child. Good temperament, the kind of clinical language that erases the fact that this was a little boy who was, according to a neighbor's later testimony, afraid of thunderstorms and slept with a carved wooden horse his father had made. He was sold to a Mississippi plantation for $400. Finally, there was Mary, only 3 years old, sold for $300 to a Savannah family as a future lady's maid, which meant she'd be raised to serve the daughters of her owners. Mary was young enough that she might eventually forget her mother entirely. The total sale price for Jane's 4 children was $1,850. After commission and estate fees, Richard Holbrook's estate netted $1,120. In one afternoon, 4 children were transformed from family members into line items in a ledger, their entire future histories rewritten by the scratch of a pen. This is where the story gets truly chilling, because someone saw what happened next, and it nearly killed her. Her name was Patience Whitmore, a free black woman who worked as a seamstress and who had known Jane for years. On the evening of March 12, 1829, Patience went to the kitchen house behind Holbrook's property to deliver some mending. What she found was a woman who had gone somewhere beyond grief. Jane was sitting on the floor, surrounded by her children's clothing. A small shirt, a worn dress, a pair of shoes too small for anyone but a 3-year-old. She was folding and unfolding the items with mechanical precision, her lips moving soundlessly. When Patience spoke to her, Jane looked up, and Patience would later testify that the look on Jane's face was like looking at someone who had already died but whose body had not received the news. But it was what Jane said next that would haunt Patience for the rest of her life. In a voice perfectly calm, perfectly steady, Jane said, "They took my children. They will understand what that means. Not, I will make them understand. Not, I want them to understand. Simply, they will understand." It was a statement of fact, a prediction delivered with the certainty of someone describing tomorrow's sunrise. Patience tried to reason with her, to offer comfort, to suggest prayer. Jane just smiled, a horrible, empty smile, and said, "I've already prayed." God answered. Patience. Whitmore did what she thought was right. She went to the authorities. Specifically, she went to the city constable and reported that Jane was making threats. Let's be real. What Patience actually reported was that Jane was making her uncomfortable, that there was something wrong, that she was frightened for the white people in that household. The constable's response is documented in city records. He essentially told Patience that grief-stricken slaves were not his concern unless they actually committed a crime, and that if she was worried, she should inform the household. So Patience went to Thomas Cuyler, who'd been helping manage Holbrook's affairs. Cuyler's response was dismissive to the point of contempt. He told Patience that Jane was adjusting to her new circumstances, and that Negro women are naturally given to emotional displays that signify nothing. He suggested Patience was misinterpreting exhaustion for something more sinister. The subtext was clear. A free black woman reporting concern about an enslaved black woman's state of mind was simply not credible. The racial mathematics of testimony meant that Patience's warning was worth less than nothing. It was actually treated as evidence of paranoia or attention-seeking. So Patience went home, and for the rest of her life, she would live with the knowledge that she'd seen the warning signs and been dismissed. The trauma of that dismissal, of being rendered invisible and inaudible, of knowing what was coming and being powerless to stop it, would manifest in nightmares for years afterward. Now you have to understand, there actually was a brief inquiry into Jane's state of mind, but it was designed to protect property, not prevent tragedy. James Blackwood, the overseer, conducted what he called an inspection of Jane's fitness for continued service. His methodology consisted of asking her a series of questions. Could she perform her duties? Was she eating? Did she understand her circumstances? Jane answered yes to all of them. She was calm, compliant, even deferential. Blackwood noted in his report that while Jane showed some melancholic tendency, she remained serviceable and obedient. The inquiry lasted approximately 10 minutes. What Blackwood never asked, because the question would have been philosophically impossible within the framework of slavery, was whether Jane was planning violence. To ask that question would be to admit that enslaved people were capable of sophisticated planning, of delayed gratification, of strategic thinking, all qualities that would undermine the fundamental justifications for slavery itself. The system required enslaved people to be simultaneously dangerous enough to require brutal control and simple-minded enough to justify that control. This logical contradiction meant that signs of dangerous intelligence were systematically misread as harmless simplicity. So when Jane carefully performed docility, the performance was taken at face value because the alternative, that she was capable of deception, planning, and delayed revenge, was ideologically unthinkable. The inquiry concluded that Jane was fit for service and required no special supervision. The document was filed, forgotten, and would later be entered as evidence in the trial. In the weeks following the sale of her children, Jane changed in ways that should have been recognized as warning signs but were instead interpreted as submission. Multiple witnesses later testified to these changes. She stopped speaking unless directly addressed. Her movements became economical, purposeful, stripped of any wasted motion. She lost weight. One witness estimated she dropped 20 pounds, but her work never suffered. If anything, she became more efficient, more mechanical. A neighbor woman, Sarah Hendricks, later testified that she'd seen Jane in the market and been disturbed by her appearance. She looked through me as though I wasn't there. Her eyes had no light in them, like windows to an empty house. But the most chilling change was noted by another enslaved woman named Ruth, who worked in an adjacent household. Ruth testified that Jane had begun singing while she worked, hymns, mostly, but with altered lyrics that Ruth found disturbing. One in particular stood out. Where the traditional hymn spoke of salvation and heavenly reunion, Jane sang about earthly reunion and earthly justice. The phrase Ruth remembered was, "I shall know them by their deeds, and their deeds shall answer for them." Ruth asked Jane what she meant, and Jane replied, "Nothing that concerns you. God has shown me what needs doing, and I am his instrument." Ruth, frightened, mentioned this to her own master, who dismissed it as religious enthusiasm common among enslaved people. The altered victim was right there, visible, speaking her intentions in coded language, and everyone interpreted the code incorrectly. What Jane planned next demonstrated a level of premeditation and careful observation that completely contradicted the prevailing assumptions about enslaved people's capabilities. Over the course of 3 weeks, Jane studied the routines, habits, and vulnerabilities of the 3 men she held responsible for her children's sale. She learned that Richard Holbrook walked alone to his warehouse every morning at dawn, always taking the same route through the deserted commercial district. She observed that Thomas Kyler drank heavily most evenings and frequently stumbled home alone through dark streets. She noted that James Blackwood often stayed late in the overseer's quarters, isolated from the main house, accessible only by a narrow path. Jane also acquired materials with calculated precision. Rope was easy. It was everywhere in a port city, used for everything from ship rigging to securing cargo. She took small lengths from different locations over several weeks, never enough to be noticed from any single source. She studied knot tying by watching sailors at the docks, practicing in private until she could tie a hangman's noose in complete darkness. She planned not just murder, but a specific form of murder designed to send a message. Hanging wasn't random. It was the execution method reserved for slaves who killed their masters, a public spectacle meant to reinforce the power structure. By choosing to hang her victims, Jane was appropriating the very symbol of her own people's oppression and turning it back on their oppressors. This wasn't crime of passion. It was calculated political violence disguised as personal revenge. The hero of this story is someone you've never heard of, and that's intentional. The historical record tried very hard to erase him. His name was Benjamin Wright, a free black man in his 30s who worked as a drayman, hauling goods between the docks and warehouses. Benjamin had a personal investment in this story. His own wife and daughter had been sold south 5 years earlier when his wife's owner died and the estate was liquidated. He'd spent those 5 years working every available hour, saving money, trying to track down his family, but the paper trail had gone cold in Mississippi. When Benjamin saw Jane in the market in mid-March of 1829, he recognized something in her expression, that same dead-eyed determination he'd seen in his own mirror for years. He approached her carefully, using the coded language that free and enslaved black people had developed for dangerous conversations. He asked if she was walking a dark road, and she answered yes. He asked if she'd found the end of that road, and she answered yes. He asked if he could walk with her for a ways, meaning could he help, and she said no, that this was her road alone. But Benjamin couldn't let it go. Not because he thought he could stop her, but because he knew that whatever Jane was planning would have consequences far beyond herself. When enslaved people committed violence against white people, the entire black community, free and enslaved, suffered the retaliation. Benjamin Wright became the reluctant hero, trying not to save the villains, but to save his community from the aftermath. Benjamin began asking careful questions, piecing together what Jane was planning by observing patterns and changes. He noticed she'd been asking other enslaved people about the routines of Holbrook, Cuyler, and Blackwood. Innocent-seeming questions about when they came and went, what routes they traveled, who they met with. He noticed she'd acquired rope. He saw her practicing knots while sitting alone in the evening. Most damning, he overheard a conversation between Jane and another enslaved woman where Jane said, "By the new moon, things will be balanced." The new moon was 3 days away. Benjamin faced an impossible choice. If he went to white authorities, he'd be condemning Jane to certain death. She'd be hanged for conspiracy even if she hadn't acted yet. If he told other free black people, he'd be spreading information that could be tortured out of them later. If he confronted Jane directly, she might accelerate her timeline. And if he did nothing, 3 white men would die, and the retaliation would be swift and indiscriminate. Benjamin chose a middle path. He decided to shadow Jane, to stay close enough to intervene at the critical moment, to physically stop her if necessary. For 3 days and nights, Benjamin barely slept, watching Jane's movements, tracking her routes. He saw her walk past Holbrook's warehouse repeatedly, studying the approaches. He saw her linger near the alley where Cuyler typically walked home. He saw her standing in the darkness near Blackwood's quarters. But what he didn't see, what no one saw, was Jane's actual preparation. Because she'd become invisible in the way that enslaved people could become invisible. By being exactly where she was expected to be, doing exactly what she was expected to do, until the moment she didn't. Can you handle what comes next? Because this is where the story turns truly chilling. What Jane did wasn't spontaneous violence born from emotional breakdown. It was systematic execution carried out with cold precision over the course of a single night. Before we continue, I need you to understand something. The historical record of what happened next comes from multiple sources: witness testimonies, criminal trial documents, newspaper accounts, and private letters. The details are confirmed, documented, and deeply disturbing. If you're watching this alone in the dark, maybe turn on a light. If you're listening with headphones, maybe take one out. And if you're someone who believes that oppressed people should only resist through peaceful means, what you're about to hear will challenge that comfortable belief. This isn't a story with easy morals. It's a story about what happens when every legitimate avenue for justice is closed, when the law itself is the instrument of oppression, and when a mother's grief becomes a weapon. March 19th, 1829, new moon. Benjamin Wright stationed himself in an alley with a clear view of Holbrook's warehouse, convinced that if Jane was going to act, it would be at dawn when Holbrook made his routine walk. Benjamin was right about the target, but wrong about the method. Jane didn't confront Holbrook on the street. She was already inside the warehouse, having entered hours earlier using a key she'd copied months before. Yes, she'd planned that far ahead. At 5:47 a.m., Richard Holbrook unlocked his warehouse door and stepped inside. What happened next was reconstructed from physical evidence because there were no witnesses. Jane attacked from behind with a weighted sock, a common improvised weapon, stunning Holbrook long enough to get the noose around his neck. She'd prepared a pulley system using the warehouse's own loading equipment. The rope went up through a ceiling beam and down to a cleat on the wall. Holbrook regained consciousness while being hoisted up, which we know because his fingernails were bloody from clawing at the noose. Jane secured the rope and watched him die, which took approximately 4 minutes. Then she did something that transformed this from murder into message. She pinned a note to Holbrook's chest. The note read, "4 children, 4 minutes for each. You understand now." The handwriting was Jane's. Remember, she could write. She'd taught herself from the same book she'd used to teach her son Samuel. Jane left Holbrook's body hanging and walked calmly out of the warehouse just as dawn was breaking. Benjamin Wright saw her emerge and knew immediately what had happened. He ran to her, grabbed her arm, and said, "Jane, what have you done?" She looked at him with perfect clarity and said, "What was necessary? Don't follow me." Then she walked away toward the residential district where Thomas Kyler lived. Benjamin faced the decision point: raise the alarm now and possibly save Kyler and Blackwood, or let Jane finish what she'd started. He chose a third option that would haunt him forever. He did nothing. He stood frozen in that alley, paralyzed by conflicting loyalties, until Jane had disappeared into the morning mist. By the time Benjamin finally ran toward Kyler's home, it was too late. Jane had entered through an unlocked garden door. Kyler, drunk from the night before, hadn't secured his house. She found him passed out in his study, still in his clothes from the previous evening. The process was the same: weighted sock, noose, pulley system rigged to the exposed beam in his study ceiling. But this time Jane modified her message. The note pinned to Kyler's chest read, "You counted them in your ledger. I counted your breaths. 1,650, one for each dollar." Kyler had apparently regained consciousness during the hanging and struggled, based on the evidence. Jane had counted every breath until he stopped. By 7 a.m., Benjamin Wright had reached the constable's office, stammering out a warning about James Blackwood, the third target. A group of 5 men, including the constable and 2 armed citizens, rushed to Blackwood's quarters in the overseer's compound. They were too late. Jane had moved with impossible speed, as though she'd choreographed the entire sequence. Blackwood was hanging from the rafters of his own quarters, and Jane was sitting calmly on his bed, waiting. The note on Blackwood's chest read, "You made them call you master. I made you understand slavery." When the constable burst through the door, Jane didn't run. She didn't fight. She simply stood up and said, "I'm finished now. You may take me." The reversal here is crucial. Jane had never intended to escape. This wasn't murder followed by flight. It was execution followed by surrender. She'd planned from the beginning to be caught, to face trial, to have her story told in the most public forum available. By surrendering calmly and claiming responsibility, she transformed herself from a fugitive into a witness, from a criminal into a testimony. The constable, a man named William Thorne, later testified that Jane showed no emotion, no fear, no remorse. When he asked her why she'd done it, she replied, "I am a mother. That is the only explanation required." Then she extended her hands for the shackles and walked quietly to her imprisonment. Having achieved exactly what she'd set out to achieve, she'd made them understand. The investigation into the 3 murders revealed a chamber of horrors, but not the kind you're imagining. The horror was in the documentation. When authorities searched Augustus Moore's office, the clerk who'd processed the sale of Jane's children, they found meticulous records of not just Jane's children, but hundreds of families systematically destroyed by sale and separation. Moore had kept a separate ledger, apparently for his own interest, tracking which sales involved family separations. Next to each entry, he'd noted the emotional display of the enslaved people being separated, rating them on a scale from no reaction to excessive disturbance. Jane's children's sale was noted as mother displayed excessive disturbance, required physical restraint. This ledger would become central evidence in Jane's trial, but not in the way you'd expect. In Thomas Kyler's home, investigators found correspondence with plantation owners across the Deep South, a network of buyers and sellers trading information about premium breeding stock, their term for young enslaved women. Several letters specifically discussed strategies for separating children from mothers at optimal ages to maximize long-term profit while minimizing immediate disruption. One letter, dated 2 weeks before Jane's children were sold, contained the phrase, "The maternal bond, while temporarily disruptive, is economically irrelevant and should not influence timing of sales." In Richard Holbrook's papers, investigators found his last will and testament, which included Jane as property to be sold after his death, along with a note, "The woman Jane shows signs of melancholy and may require correction. Recommend sale to field work rather than household service." The trial of Jane, her full name was recorded as Jane Williams, taking her deceased husband's name, became a spectacle that revealed more about her victims than about Jane herself. Richard Holbrook, the pillar of the community, was revealed through witness testimony to have sold at least 47 enslaved people over the previous decade, separating dozens of families. His business records showed he'd made significant profits by buying enslaved families at estate sales, then breaking them up for individual resale. Thomas Kyler's past was even darker. He'd started his career as a slave catcher, tracking down escaped enslaved people for bounty, and had been accused, though never charged, of kidnapping free black people and selling them into slavery. His transition to legitimate slave trading was merely a change in methodology, not morality. James Blackwood's history included multiple accusations of excessive violence against enslaved people, including the death of a 12-year-old boy from a beating in 1826. No charges were filed, because the boy was property and Blackwood claimed he was correcting insolence. But the true unmasking was their public reputation versus private reality. All three men were eulogized in initial newspaper reports as victims of a savage murder. But as the trial progressed and evidence accumulated, the narrative began to fracture. Letters to newspaper editors questioned whether the victims were perhaps not entirely innocent. One letter writer, anonymous, stated, "If we create a system where mothers can be torn from children with impunity, can we truly claim surprise when motherhood takes its revenge?" The investigation into the three murders inadvertently exposed a vast regional network of family separation and human trafficking. Augustus Moore's ledgers revealed connections to slave traders in Charleston, New Orleans, Richmond, and Mobile. The system was sophisticated. Traders would communicate about upcoming estate sales, coordinate purchases to avoid driving up prices, and strategically separate families to maximize profits. Children were particularly valuable when sold separately because buyers could train them up without the interference of parents who might teach them about their origins or encourage resistance. The network extended internationally. Several of Moore's correspondents had connections to illegal slave traders, who were still importing enslaved people from Africa despite the 1808 prohibition, using Cuba as a transit point. One letter referenced fresh stock and uncontaminated by domestic influences, meaning enslaved people who'd never known family structures that might complicate their exploitation. The scope was staggering. In the 5-year period from 1824 to 1829, records showed at least 3,400 enslaved children under the age of 12 were sold separately from their parents through the Savannah market alone. Jane's 4 children were a statistical blip in an industrial-scale operation of family destruction. But the network's exposure changed nothing systemically. These weren't illegal activities. They were documented, taxed, regulated business operations. The crime wasn't the network. The crime was Jane's response to it. That's the horror here. The system itself was legal, protected, and considered essential to the economy. Jane's murders were atrocities. The routine destruction of thousands of families was merely business. Now let's be real about how Savannah society responded to these revelations. Despite the overwhelming documentation of systematic family destruction, despite the evidence of calculated cruelty, despite the moral catastrophe laid bare in those ledgers and letters, the dominant narrative quickly became, Jane was an aberration, a mad woman, an exception that proved nothing about the system itself. Newspapers that had initially questioned the victim's innocence quickly reversed course under pressure from commercial interests. The Savannah Georgian ran an editorial stating, "While we acknowledge that the peculiar institution may occasionally produce individual hardships, we cannot allow isolated incidents of violence to undermine an economic system upon which our prosperity depends." Translation: We see the problem, but we're choosing profit over principle. Church leaders who privately expressed discomfort with family separations publicly defended the practice as biblically sanctioned. One prominent minister preached a sermon titled, "The Curse of Ham and the Limits of Maternal Bonds," arguing that enslaved people's familial feelings were less developed than white people's, and therefore separation was less traumatic for them. Political leaders who might have pushed for even modest reforms, perhaps keeping mothers and young children together, remained silent because cotton was king and cotton required enslaved labor, and enslaved labor was easier to control when family bonds were systematically destroyed. The conspiracy of silence wasn't a secret cabal. It was an entire society collectively deciding that acknowledging the full humanity of enslaved people would be too economically disruptive. Jane's trial exposed the machinery of oppression in unprecedented detail, and society's response was essentially, yes, and? Jane Williams was convicted of 3 counts of murder after a trial that lasted 2 days. The verdict was never in doubt. She'd confessed, the evidence was overwhelming, and the jury was composed entirely of white men with economic interests in slavery's continuation. She was sentenced to death by hanging, the same method she'd used on her victims. The execution was scheduled for June 15, 1829, and was carried out publicly in Johnson Square, the same location where her children had been sold 3 months earlier. Thousands attended, both white spectators treating it as entertainment and enslaved people forced to witness as a warning. Jane's last words, recorded by multiple witnesses, were, "My children's names were Samuel, Catherine, Jacob, and Mary. Remember them." She refused the customary prayer with a minister, refused the hood offered to cover her face, and reportedly maintained eye contact with the crowd until the trap door opened. She was 32 years old. Benjamin Wright, the reluctant hero who'd tried to intervene, was questioned extensively, but never charged with any crime. However, his reputation in both black and white communities was destroyed. Black people saw him as someone who'd betrayed Jane by alerting authorities, while white people viewed him as suspiciously knowledgeable about the murders. He left Savannah within a year and disappeared from historical records. Augustus Moore, the clerk, continued his business processing slave sales until his death from yellow fever in 1835. Patience Whitmore, the witness who'd tried to warn people, lived with survivors' guilt for decades, eventually joining the abolitionist movement in the 1840s and speaking publicly about Jane's story. Though her testimony was largely dismissed as exaggeration by white audiences who preferred to remember Jane as simply mad rather than justified. The legacy of Jane Williams, the widow of Savannah, is a story written in invisible ink, visible only when held up to the harsh light of historical honesty. In the immediate aftermath of her execution, Savannah's white establishment worked systematically to erase her from memory. Newspaper archives were selectively preserved, omitting the most damning trial testimony about family separations. Church records that mentioned her were annotated with dismissive phrases like deranged negress and cautionary tale of indulgence. But in the enslaved community, Jane became something else entirely. A whispered legend, a ghost story told in quarters after dark, a name invoked when mothers held their children close. Oral histories preserved by descendants of enslaved people refer to her as the Mother of Vengeance, and some accounts claim that after her execution, slaveholders in Savannah became noticeably more cautious about public family separations, not out of morality, but out of fear. The moral here isn't simple, and anyone offering you a simple moral is lying. Jane committed murder, premeditated, calculated, brutal murder. She took 3 human lives with her own hands. But those 3 men participated in a system that had destroyed thousands of families, that had calculated the precise dollar value of a mother's grief, that had created the very conditions that transformed a devoted mother into an executioner. The question isn't whether Jane was justified. The question is, what kind of society creates situations where such terrible choices become comprehensible? We built a machine that processed human beings as commodities, and then expressed horror when one of those human beings responded with human rage. So here's what haunts me about Jane Williams' story, and what should haunt you too. Could something like this happen today? Before you answer no, before you comfort yourself with the notion that we've evolved beyond such barbarism, consider this. Right now, in 2025, there are systems that separate families as policy, that calculate human value in economic terms, that create bureaucratic distance between decision-makers and consequences. The mechanisms have changed, but the underlying logic, that some people's humanity is negotiable, that some suffering is acceptable for the greater economic good, that logic never died. It just found new expressions, new justifications, new vocabularies. Jane Williams forced her society to see what it was doing, even if only for a moment. Even if that moment changed nothing systemically. She made 3 men understand, in their final minutes, what they'd inflicted on others. Whether that was justice or revenge or terrorism depends entirely on where you're standing and whose children we're discussing. If this story disturbed you, good. It should. Drop a comment telling us what you think. Was Jane a murderer or a freedom fighter? Is there a difference? Subscribe, because next week we're traveling to 1850s Tennessee to investigate the schoolhouse. Disappearances, where 17 enslaved children vanished from a plantation school over 3 years. Their owner claimed they'd been apprenticed out, and a traveling preacher discovered the truth buried in a root cellar. You think Jane's story was dark? You haven't seen anything yet.